Hey everyone, it's Lewis from the Coding Hoja channel here. Today's video is actually going to be a little bit of a different format. It's going to be a PowerPoint, and it's actually a presentation that I've given a handful of times to students at the bootcamp. But this time I've re-recorded it for YouTube presentation. So this presentation is going to be about finding jobs in the USA, Canada, Europe, and so on. And without saying anything else, let's jump straight to the presentation. Hi everyone, today's topic is going to be about getting a job in the USA, Canada, or Europe. But actually, a lot of the things that I'll talk about today apply in general, right? So actually they apply to any job, but specifically to set up the context, one of the most common questions that I get from students when I worked in Turkey and Russia is, how can I get a job in Canada, Europe, or the USA? And people ask this for multiple reasons. Maybe they just want something new in life. A lot of the time it's because they want to move to a place that has a stronger currency, and sometimes it's because of the political, social, or economic situation in the country, right? But nonetheless, regardless of the reason, this is, I think, the number one most common question I get. And so that's what I'm going to dissect today and talk about some concrete steps and some things to consider, surrounding this question. Like, there is no magic one answer to how you get this job, and that's why we'll be taking a look at it from, multiple facets. Quickly about me, you can always check the trailer in my channel if you want to know more, but I left Google as a senior software engineer and I became a teacher. I taught in Istanbul, Turkey, and Moscow, Russia. And, I've hired past students to work at my startup. I talk often with students who find jobs or don't find jobs, and I look frequently at CVs, even, probably once every 2 weeks, a student who's seen a recording of this presentation, not this one, but, a past iteration, emails me the CV and asks me to look. And all this is to say that I think I have a pretty well-rounded outlook of, people who are looking for jobs, right? Like, what are their CVs like? What is their experience like? What are they like as people too, So again, this advice applies generally, but the intended audience in general is, say, you live in a country with a weak currency, you want to move away. Maybe you dream of getting a job in Europe, Canada, and the United States. And most likely, English isn't your native language, right? And that's something that I'll talk about a little bit. If it is your native language, it's not important. You can ignore the stuff in the presentation. But this is also a factor that you have to consider when we're talking about applying to jobs in this context. So one thing I'll note before I get started on the core of it is that the hardest part is usually the visa. And I don't have any advice on this specifically in this video because this presentation is more about the general process and advice, but I do have another video, which I'll put somewhere here, talking about, in my opinion, what the most important part is to persuade someone that you're worth all the trouble to give you a visa to move somewhere else, right? So check out that video. But other than that, we'll go straight and move on to the topics for today. So today's topics are divided into 3 parts. The first is the resume or the CV. The second is applying for jobs themselves. And the third is the interviews. And in each of these, I will logically break down some steps and give you concrete things that you should do. But I do want to remind everyone that I'm not working on this in theory. These are not things that I randomly thought up of. Everything I say today is largely based on real-life mistakes that I've seen from students, right? I've interacted with many students and I see them making, pretty serious mistakes in their CV. We'll talk about them in this presentation, or, have misconceptions about the interview process and so on. And these are all reasons why I've included things in this presentation. They're based on real-life mistakes that other people, maybe similar to the position that you're in, are also making. So let's go to the first and very important topic, which is resumes, also known as CVs. So one thing I want to say is that your resume is the first step. And in my opinion, in my humble opinion, many people are not putting enough effort into it. With your CV or resume, you have 30 seconds maximum to sell yourself well, because that's pretty much how long someone will spend reading it, right? You have to understand that these employers, they're going through a lot of LinkedIns. They're going through a lot of resumes. And, they don't have that much time to read yours specifically. And so in those 30 seconds, you really need to have an impact on them. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some common mistakes that I've seen with people's CVs. The first is length, okay? Maybe it's too long or too short. you can think of the resume, if we're talking in terms of algorithms, as an optimization problem. And that optimization problem is that you want to minimize the length, but maximize the impact, right? So in the shortest way possible, really persuade someone that they should hire you. The second biggest mistake, well, it says mistakes here, but grammatical mistakes, language mistakes, right? Again, all of my students are not native English speakers, and the CV needs proofreading. We'll talk about that later. And the third most common mistake is that it's not impactful enough, right? You need to really emphasize what you did that's impressive, not just to tell me what you did, but to persuade me that what you did is impressive. So, how do we address these mistakes, right? What do you need to do? And here's a list of concrete steps, right? I'll give an overview and we'll dive into some of them more deeply. The first is to understand the expectations for each region. And I'll give you an example. Multiple students have sent me CVs with pictures on them to apply for jobs in the USA. Maybe you can take a second to guess why that might be bad, because it's instant rejection as far as I know in the USA. So if you don't know, in the USA, employers are scared that if I see a picture of you, I might have a tendency to bias based on how you look. Maybe because I saw that you're a woman, or maybe because I saw that you're Asian, right? It doesn't matter. But they don't want to have any legal basis for this. Another example is the length. In Canada, multiple pages is okay, but students are sending me 4-page resumes for the USA, and that's absolutely no. In the USA, everyone wants a 1-page resume. Okay. The second thing you need to do is proofread. Okay. And you can find or pay a native English speaker to proofread your resume on a site like Upwork, or find a friend, which is a free option, hopefully. But this is really important, okay, because these mistakes matter. If your resume is full of grammar errors and the person next to you, the next application has 0 grammar errors, in this aspect, your application would be inferior, right? And you want to take every advantage you can. The third thing you need to do is look at examples on the internet. And there's plenty of examples of resumes on the internet for IT. We're not going to go over them today. Go to www.google.com, type in example resume tech job, okay? And take a look at it, think about it, compare it with yours, right? And the last one is to emphasize impact by focusing on numbers, projects launched, personal contribution, and so on. But we'll delve into that a little deeper in the next few slides. So again, on region, I'm not going to go through a list in this presentation of what's expected in every region. And to be honest, I literally have no idea how applying to jobs in Europe works. But luckily, there's a website called Google and a few other competitors where you can simply search this. But most people are not even taking this step, as I mentioned, right? Like, I've received uncountable number of resumes where something was not done with the basic checks of what's required for a region. And that's why I have it in this presentation to tell you. If you're trying to apply to a job in Germany, in Antarctica, in Canada, use Google to find what the expectations are for the CV in that region. Now, another thing I brought up earlier was emphasizing impact, and we'll take a look at a few examples right now. So here's an example of something that I saw on a CV, right? Like, worked on a cloud administrative tool in JS and React with an Express backend. Okay, it's like, cool, you worked on a tool. That's fine, right? Here I've rephrased it a little just to make it slightly more impactful, right? Primary contributor to 3 cloud portals used in production by 4 clients, JS, React, Express. So there's a few things I want to point out. The first is that I'm now using numbers, right? 3 cloud portals, 4 clients. Like, the absolute numbers are not super important, but it's almost kind of like a mind game. I said it, so probably 3 cloud portals is considered a lot, right? It's as short as possible. I've kind of moved the technologies into the parentheses at the end. And finally, it emphasizes my role as primary contributor, right? It's not just, I worked on a cloud administrative tool. Hey, I was the primary contributor to this cloud portal, right? That sounds a little better. So here's another example. Team lead of 5 people. Okay, but what did you do, right? Team lead of 5, responsible for mentoring and reviewing code. Okay, all good things. I like to see when people review code. Communicated with stakeholders and represented team in cross-team functions. Also good, right? Showing I have responsibility that goes beyond just my team, right? Like, I know if you're team lead, you have some responsibility, supposedly, but spell it out for me, right? This person communicated with stakeholders, maybe other teams, maybe other companies, and represented the team as the head honcho when there were cross-team functions. So, in summary, if I had to say this concisely, use numbers, use concrete accomplishments, right? In my opinion, most of the things I'm seeing on resumes are a little abstract, and the more concrete you are, generally the more impressive it is. Of course, again, remember you want to keep things brief. So my conclusion on resumes, again, just to frame it in a certain way of thought for you, a resume is an investment, okay? If you're spending 5 to 10 hours on a resume, which seems quite long, I think most of my students have spent fewer than that. You're spending that on a resume that will give you a job 40 hours a week, maybe for years. And you can reuse this resume later, right? So if you just do the math, like the ratio, 5 to 10 hours on a resume, that's like 40 times 52 hours of getting paid and having a job, right? Like it's worth it to spend that time. So it's not something, in my opinion, that you should just do 1 to 2 hours and call it done. It's something that you should make perfect. It's something that you should really think about how other people look at it, and make it strong, because that thing is going to matter when you apply to jobs. It's going to be the first thing people see about you. So let's move off this piece of paper, the resume, and talk about the job search now, the actual job search. Truthfully, I'm not familiar with the best platforms to find jobs for foreigners in 2022 or 2023. Sorry, I forgot to change the year here. Sue me, as I'm not one. Okay, and that, of course, that's relative to the United States. But I can share what my students use and some things I've heard. Right, but it's not exhaustive at all. Right, I think doing a Google search on good job search platforms is probably going to be better. Of course, there's LinkedIn. I've had lots of students find jobs just through LinkedIn. There's agencies and recruiters, but this depends by country, and sometimes, maybe they'll take a cut or something like this. There's this site for front-end people that one of my students recommended, javascript.works-hub.com, right? It's a website. And then all these job portals like Monster, Indeed, etc. But my recommendation personally, timeless, independent of the existence of these websites, my recommendation is to get referrals, to ask other friends who have found foreign jobs, like, where did you find your job, and any open spots at your company, smiley face. That's how people who write in Cyrillic make smiley faces, with a parentheses and no eyes. But actually, if you don't know, at big companies like Google, Amazon, and so on, their mentality is generally that the best employees come from referrals, from who our own employees know. And it's quite true, because good people know good people. That's generally the rule. And in fact, there's a reward, a referral bonus, we called it. If I referred someone at Google and they got hired, I would get like some crazy amount of money. I don't remember, like a few $1,000s, maybe $8,000, $10,000. I'm making up numbers. I don't remember. But unfortunately, all my friends suck. So I referred like 10 people. None of them got a job. And if they watch this, like, I'm sorry, but you did not fulfill my desires, because I've never gotten, a friend who fulfilled the referral bonus. But the point of this anecdote is to show that companies do really emphasize on referrals, and they know that good workers know good people, right? And so if you're on the flip side, if you're looking for a job, my recommendation, number one, is to ask your friends who already have jobs at places that you want to work, right? And maybe they'll contact HR, maybe they'll talk to their boss, see if there's room on their team. But to me, this is by far, it's better than any other site if you have some type of connection. And you don't even have to know them well, to be honest. Like, they could be an acquaintance. So one thing that I want to note is that, truthfully, applying for jobs, especially, for overseas one, relative to where you are, is a lot of time and a lot of labor spent searching. This is true in general, whether you're applying in your home country or whether you're applying abroad. And what I want to emphasize is basically not to give up, right? More applications equals higher chance. And again, I want to remind people of this math here, that you're putting in like N hours for a job that could last you a year or more, probably a year to 3 years, right? At least. So think about it, right? 40 hours, a normal work week, putting in 40 hours finding applications, finding jobs to apply to. Yes, it's mind-numbing work, but the ratio for 1 year is like, 40 hours, one work week, to getting 52 plus weeks of work. It's a pretty good return, you might say. So make sure you persevere. Make sure that more applications, make sure you keep in mind that more applications is a higher chance. And in general, don't give up. And if things aren't working, of course, it's always good to get feedback and have a second set of eyes on your resume or your CV. So, last but not least, usually the final step in the process is going to be interviews, which is a very varied topic. And there's quite a few videos on the YouTube about interviews. In my head, there's generally two categories of interviews, and it totally depends on the company. It totally depends on the region, right? First is soft interview questions. That's how I think about it. Like, not technical, just talk about yourself. Tell me what you like to do, right? The second is technical interview questions. Now, this can range anywhere from simple questions about JavaScript to, hardcore algorithm questions. And from what I've seen about YouTube videos, they seem very concerned about, these hardcore algorithm questions, but honestly, most of the time, the questions fall in the other category, right? But we'll talk about this in more detail in the coming slides. So in general, what do you need to do for interviews? The first thing I'm going to say is you need to prepare. And it's really obvious, but again, this is based on real life mistakes from my students. And you need to prepare and practice, in my opinion, answers to common questions. Because actually, most questions should not be a surprise. Okay, I gave two examples here. Like, what is your biggest weakness? This is like the canonical, stereotypical job interview question, right? The second question is, tell me about your current work, right? If someone asks you these two questions and you don't I'm not saying you have to have a script memorized, but if you don't at least have some idea of something to say immediately, to me, it means you probably didn't prepare very much, right? Because, or tell me about your past work, right? Because this is almost obviously something that they're going to ask. So I'm not going to put a list of exhaustive common questions here. You can find this on the internet, or you can simply think, or as I'll tell you later, you can kind of talk to your friends and so on to find resources about interview questions. But the point is, please, please, please prepare and practice some answers to common questions. Now, the second thing that you need to do is actually practice the interview. So what I mean is that thinking about these answers in the shower is not the same as sitting down with someone and practicing saying out loud or solving algorithm questions on a whiteboard. These are different processes. And again, if your native language isn't English, you should definitely be practicing saying these things, expressing these things in a foreign language at least a few times, right? It's not easy. And so I think what I'm contrasting this again is with silently practicing or writing it down the answers. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you literally need to sit down. You need to say these things out loud. You need to have practice interviews. So let's talk about the first category of interview questions that I talked about, and that's soft interview questions. So let's frame it this way. What is your goal during this interview question? Your goal should be to show your passion for programming, for your work, in the way that you talk, right? And again, I always ask whether, it's in this topic or another, think from the perspective of the person hiring. Who would you rather hire? Someone who is clearly passionate, who's crazy about programming, I don't know, you're talking to them in the interview and they're like, "Oh man, I saw this new React library yesterday. It was super cool. And I saw this new Vue add-on the other day. Oh, have you heard of this new framework?" Right? Yeah, I've been playing around with it, right? And so who would you rather hire? That type of person who's clearly passionate, or someone who just gives standard answers like, "Yeah, I worked in React. Oh yeah, I also use this add-on. Yeah, I've done some GraphQL. Yeah, that was my past job," right? It's passion goes a long way, and soft interview questions, they're, to me, really, they're all about showing passion. That's what the interviewer wants to see. And what I'm going to say is, if you don't really feel that passion, just please at least try to pretend, right, for this interview so that you can get that job. The second category is technical interview questions. And your goal in technical interview questions is to show the way that you think, right? So a lot of people have this misconception that technical interview questions, algorithmic interview questions are about getting the right answer and the wrong answer. Okay, they're partially about that. But actually, I would say 80% about it is not about the right answer or the wrong answer. It's about how this person thinks and solves problems. Okay, so that's why, again, I'm orienting you on the goal when you're faced with such a question. Show the way that you think. You want to show a few things. First, you want to show that you're a logical, methodical thinker. The second, you want to show that you anticipate mistakes in edge cases. So like, oh, what if this input string was zero length? And the third is, again, you want to show that you're passionate. You have a chance to show, even when you're solving the problem, that you're passionate about code. Maybe you're like, oh man, this code doesn't look clean. If this was a real app, I would have written this code some other way, but I don't have time right now, so I'm not going to show you, But I won't delve too deep into this one for like the algorithmic interview questions because I haven't really watched these videos, but I think they're very well documented online and on YouTube, and there's books about them, right? But for this category of questions, this would be my short summary of the things to keep in mind. So in general, for interviews, here are a couple of resources, right? Cracking the Coding Interview is like the go-to book for algorithmic interviews. You can find it by Googling it. You can also use Google to find example interviews. As I just mentioned, interview studying and practice interviews over the past 10 years has become extremely well documented on the internet. And I've never watched one, but I've seen, like clips of people doing practice interviews in any language you want on various difficulties of questions, right? So you can find these and get an idea of what's right or wrong to say in the interview. And finally, a good resource is your friends, right? Because your friends probably live in the same country as you. They're probably applying to similar types of companies as you. And, they might be getting take-home tasks. They might be getting asked certain questions. These are all things that you can find out within your locality, right? So that's all I have about interviews. Let's go through some closing thoughts. Getting jobs abroad with relocation is very competitive. Okay, and I actually have another video about this. I'm going to put this here. It's the same one that I showed before. But what qualities do the best candidates have? And in this other 15-minute video, I talk about this until you get sick of hearing about it, but I'll summarize it quickly here. The first is that they're curious, and their resume reflects an experience with a variety of technologies. The second is that they're good at programming. Okay, there's no replacement for this, and it reflects in their work. It reflects in the way that they talk about things, and maybe it's even shown on their GitHub or their sample code, right, or their take-home tasks or their interview results. Okay, and so finally, they're usually pretty good at English, right? Like it doesn't need to be perfect. I'm not saying that these people speak with, native C2 level fluency, but definitely good enough to converse in an interview. And it may be something that you need to consider practicing as well if you feel your English level is not quite there yet. My recommendations overall, besides all the other stuff that I just recommended in this video, the first is to, as I just said, study your English if it's not native level. I'm not saying every day, once or twice a week on italki, Cambly, your private tutor, with your English-speaking friends, texting, it doesn't matter, right? But find opportunities to study your English because that type of stuff makes an impression and it does matter. The second is to study algorithms, also at least once or twice a week is my recommendation, but again, it depends on your life situation. And the third is to proofread and sharpen your resume, right? Make edits based on the examples that I gave before and based on examples on the internet to make things more impactful, and also find someone to proofread your resume. So overall, I always like to remind my students that success is the result of good habits, right? And in this case, good habits would be studying your algorithms, not necessarily every day, but again, once or twice a week, studying English, and also just simply improving yourself and having good habits as a programmer, writing clean code, reviewing code, things like this. One other thing I want to remind for the third time in this presentation is to think of investment in your CV and interview prep as a time investment in your future, right? 40 hours of practice, editing, applying for jobs can lead to quite a high return from strictly a time perspective. So it's worth the time to invest it, even though it's not fun. I know it's not fun to go on LinkedIn, to apply for the 100th job you're getting rejected for, to look at your CV again and again. But that type of investment will be worth it in the big perspective of life. The second thing I want to remind in the conclusion is to think from the perspective of those hiring. And I think this is one of the most important skills, actually. Like, try not to look at your CV from your own eyes, but try to imagine what it looks like, and kind of important, what it looks like compared to other people's CVs, right? And finally, do your basic research on interview questions, example resumes, regional expectations. Google is your friend, and again, based on real life mistakes I've seen, a lot of people are skipping this step. So that concludes all I have to talk about, regarding advice for applying to jobs in USA, Europe, Canada, and so on. But again, it's very general job advice. With that being said, like, share, and subscribe. If you guys have any comments, any questions, leave them down in the comment section below.